Have you ever kept a journal? And did anyone ever read it without your permission?
My mom always said I was the sturdy one, as if that was supposed to be some kind of compliment. Even when I was a kid, I could tell sturdy wasn't about strength, it was about being useful, about not complaining, about staying out of the way. And I did. I stayed out of the way, got my homework done, didn't ask for much, didn't throw tantrums. That role, the one that involved crying at the dinner table because the chicken was dry or locking yourself in your room because someone looked at you funny, that role already belonged to my younger sister, Jessica. And trust me, she played it like she'd gone to Broadway for training. Jessica was always sensitive, anxious, misunderstood. She got away with things I wouldn't have even dared to try. One time in high school, I had a fever and asked to stay home, and my mom told me, "You'll be fine. Just drink water and push through." A month later, Jessica said she had a tightness in her chest before a history exam, and within 20 minutes, both my parents had picked her up from school and driven her to get frozen yogurt. My dad joked that mental health is important, and I just nodded, because when you're the sturdy one, sarcasm only goes one way. I learned early that if I wanted anything, I'd have to earn it without help. So I did. I worked part-time through undergrad, skipped spring breaks, paid my rent, and applied to scholarships like my life depended on them. Eventually, I got into a master's program, health informatics, not exactly thrilling dinner conversation, but it mattered to me. I did night classes, worked full-time, and still somehow managed a 4.0 GPA while half my coworkers couldn't even spell HIPAA. So when graduation came around, the real kind, the kind where you wear the heavy black gown and your name echoes across a stadium mic, I thought, maybe, just maybe, this time they'd show up. My mom had said they'd try their best, and my dad muttered something about a conference call he could reschedule. Jessica didn't say anything, of course. Why would she? It wasn't about her. The morning of the ceremony, I sat in the back seat of an Uber with my gown folded over my lap and my mortarboard pinched between my knees. I kept checking my phone, even though I hadn't gotten a text since the night before. I figured maybe they were driving in, maybe they'd show up late but still make it. Maybe they'd walk in just before my row stood up and see me cross the stage like I'd imagined so many times during all those sleepless nights and database exams. Instead, what I saw was Jessica's Instagram story. It popped up like a slap across the face. A boomerang video, her clinking a mimosa glass with my mom. They were in white robes, both wearing those smug, puffy spa headbands that make people look like they're about to perform surgery on your soul. The caption? Family Healing Weekend 2 hearts, with hearts and sparkles, and a little lotus flower emoji that made me want to crush my phone in my hand. My graduation wasn't just skipped, it was replaced. Erased. Forgotten in favor of cucumber water and seaweed wraps. I sat there on a folding chair among hundreds of other students, while the dean droned on about resilience and hard-won success, and all I could hear was my mother's voice in my head saying, "You know how much Jessica's been going through lately. She really needed this." Yeah, well, I needed them. I needed them to see me. Just once. When my name was called, I walked across the stage like my spine was steel, shook the hand of a stranger who smiled for the camera, and looked out into the sea of seats filled with proud parents and cheering families. I spotted an empty space near the aisle and stared at it a little too long, like I was trying to will them into existence. But they weren't late. They were never coming. I went home that night with a plastic folder, an empty stomach, and a slow-burning fury that curled around my ribs like smoke. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't even text them. What I did was sit down at my desk, open my laptop, and log into my company's internal portal. Let me explain something. Because of the field I work in, I get pretty good health benefits, the kind that include family coverage with a couple of extra perks if you jump through the right hoops. When I started this job, I added both of my parents to my plan, not because they asked, but because they hinted. My dad lost his job during the pandemic, and my mom's part-time gig at the library didn't come with benefits. I did it quietly, no drama. I just added them, paid the extra premium, and never mentioned it again. But sitting there that night, in my apartment that no one had sent flowers to or asked about, I remembered every time they'd told me Jessica needed more from them. I remembered the birthday where they left early because Jessica had a panic attack over a boy who ghosted her. I remembered the time I got promoted and my mom asked, "Did Jessica know?" You know how she gets when other people move forward. So I clicked on the benefits tab, navigated to medical coverage. There they were, Richard Morris and Diane Morris, covered dependents. I stared at their names for a long time, as if they might start blinking or turning red like danger signs. Then, without fanfare, I clicked Remove Dependent. A dialog box popped up. Are you sure? This action cannot be undone. My hands didn't even shake. I clicked yes. The system told me the change would take effect at midnight. I closed the laptop, made myself a sandwich, and watched a sitcom rerun with the volume too high. At some point, my phone buzzed. A voicemail. It was my dad. His voice was sharp, louder than usual, panicked in a way I hadn't heard since Jessica once disappeared for a few hours in high school. He didn't even start with, "Hi." He just barked my name, then said, "What the hell did you do? I can't log into my provider site." Diane tried to refill her prescription, and it got denied. "You can't just, Lena, you can't do that." He sounded afraid. And for the first time in a very, very long time, that made me smile. But here's the thing, this wasn't just about insurance. This was about decades of quiet swallowing, about watching the people who made you pretend not to need them hand everything to the one who never stopped needing. Maybe I finally had the guts to ask, if I'm the sturdy one, the one who never breaks, does that mean I'm just supposed to carry the weight until my spine gives out? Or do I finally get to set it down, even if it crushes someone else? And if it does crush them, does that make me heartless? Or finally free? This was just the beginning. When people talk about resentment, they often imagine something loud, fights at the dinner table, slammed doors, the kind of scenes where everyone knows something's broken. But real resentment, the kind that builds up over years and years like a slow leak in the ceiling, doesn't sound like much at all. It's quiet, subtle, almost polite in the way it seeps into everything. It shows up when you're 16 and sick with the flu, and your mom tells you to just take an Advil and suck it up because Jessica had a bad day and needs space to regulate. It sneaks in when you're 23 and get your first big job, and instead of a celebration, your dad says you should tone it down around your sister because she's still unemployed and feeling fragile. It piles up like mail in a dead neighbor's mailbox, unopened, ignored, and yet undeniably present. And that's the thing. I had collected so much of that quiet, polite, passive-aggressive garbage over the years that I didn't even realize how full I was until it spilled out in one clean, irreversible click. Remove dependent. Done. Simple. Clinical. My parents had been deleted from my world with less effort than it takes to cancel a gym membership. The next morning started like most others, except that I woke up with the kind of lightness I hadn't felt in years. It was almost physical, like I had been dragging weights on my ankles, and suddenly they'd just slipped off in the night. I made coffee, opened my laptop to check work emails, and ignored the 3 voicemails blinking red on my phone. 2 were from my dad. 1 was from my mother. None of them, I was sure, contained an apology. At around 10, I finally gave in and listened. My dad's first voicemail was still raw, clearly recorded in the immediate aftermath of discovering that his pharmacy card had stopped working. He was angry in that clipped, calculated way only men of his generation seemed to master, a mixture of frustration and embarrassment that sounded less like concern and more like a reprimand. He accused me of being reckless, of jeopardizing family health, and my personal favorite, acting out of character. I wanted to laugh at that part. As if being angry about being forgotten was some kind of costume I had decided to try on for a weekend. Then came my mom's message, and this one didn't make me laugh. It made my skin crawl in the way only carefully layered guilt can. Her voice was soft, the way she speaks when she wants to sound hurt but dignified, like a schoolteacher who's just discovered her favorite student cheated on a test. She told me she didn't understand why I was doing this, said she thought we were closer than that, reminded me how they'd supported me through school. She even threw in a line about all the sacrifices we made for both you and Jessica, which landed like a brick on my chest because I could count those sacrifices on one hand. And I had spent most of my life pretending I didn't notice they were all made in one direction. By noon, The doorbell rang, and I knew, just knew, before I even checked the peephole that it would be her. My mother. Standing there with her reusable grocery bag slung over her shoulder, like she was delivering kindness rather than a guilt offensive. I opened the door because I wasn't afraid of her. Not anymore. She smiled like she was arriving for brunch, not damage control. I brought bagels, she said, like bagels were going to erase the years of quiet neglect and reassign me the role of dutiful daughter without a murmur. I didn't say thank you. I just turned and walked to the kitchen, letting her follow. She unpacked the food like it was just another Sunday, and then sat across from me at the little breakfast bar I had put together with my own hands after assembling the pieces from a clearance rack at a furniture store. The kind of thing no one ever came over to admire. She started by talking about Jessica, of course. How she'd had a really tough week, how she cried for 3 days after her breakup, how the spa trip had been a last-minute emotional intervention, and that they hadn't realized it would land on my graduation weekend until it was already booked. She actually said those words, already booked, like they had bought concert tickets, not skipped a once-in-a-lifetime milestone. I asked her, calmly, if she knew I had given up 2 years of sleep, weekends, and dating just to walk across that stage. She blinked like I'd spoken in another language. She said, "Of course we're proud of you, honey, but you're so independent, we didn't think you'd mind." And there it was, the core lie they had always told themselves to justify everything. Lena doesn't need. Lena doesn't mind. Lena doesn't break. I asked her if she realized that Jessica never has to need because she just gets. And I don't. I have to ask. I have to perform. I have to earn. She said, "Well, that's because Jessica has always struggled more." I looked at her then, really looked, and said, "Maybe she struggles more because you never let her feel the consequences. And maybe I struggle quietly because you never gave me permission to feel anything at all." She was silent. For the first time, she was genuinely quiet, not out of strategy but maybe, just maybe, because something finally sank in. I could see in her eyes that she didn't know what to say, which was almost satisfying. Almost. She asked me if I was really going to leave them uninsured at their age. If I could live with myself knowing that they might have an emergency and no way to pay for it. I asked her if she could live with herself knowing they prioritized a bubble bath over my future. She didn't answer. I told her that I had already enrolled in an individual plan. Just for me. No dependents. That it was legal, binding, and not reversible unless there was a qualifying life event. I explained that there was no one else to cover them because Jessica didn't have a job, and that maybe, just maybe, that was their problem to solve, not mine. She left without finishing her bagel. As she walked out the door, she said, "This isn't like you, Lena." And I replied, "That's because you've never actually known me." When she left, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't second-guess myself. Instead, I opened my laptop again and began researching individual ACA plans for people over 55, because I wanted to be sure that if they did spiral, it wouldn't be because they had no options. I wasn't cruel. I was just done. Done holding up a house that never even built me a room. But the thing I didn't expect was what came next, not from them, but from him. Because while my mom had chosen bagels and guilt, my father chose silence. Until the email came. A forwarded message with no text from him at all. Just a subject line that read, "You've made this legal. So now it's legal." And attached? A scanned letter from a lawyer. Apparently, the battle had only just begun. The letter wasn't long, but it didn't need to be. It was just long enough to do what it was meant to do. Intimidate, unnerve, make me question whether my silent, clean act of digital rebellion could now be twisted into something litigious and unforgivable. It was from a small-town law office I recognized by name, not because I had ever been inside it, but because I had driven past it 100 times growing up, the kind of dusty, wood-paneled firm with one old lawyer and a secretary who probably did the real work. It wasn't a threat in the criminal sense, but it was heavy with implication. The letter outlined a concern over my recent removal of dependent coverage and suggested that the action may constitute a breach of assumed familial obligation under implied financial support, especially considering the vulnerable age and known medical needs of the parties involved. That phrase stuck with me, implied financial support. As though, by being born their daughter, I had unknowingly signed a contract that would tether me to their needs forever. Not out of love. Not out of gratitude. But out of something colder, expectation without recognition, duty without acknowledgement, a debt I never agreed to owe but was always expected to pay. I stared at the screen for a long time, not because I was afraid, but because I was stunned by the audacity. For years, they had dismissed my needs as excessive, my achievements as predictable, my requests as unnecessary. They had leaned so heavily into the idea that I was the strong one, the stable one, that they had turned my independence into a resource, like I was some kind of self-cleaning utility they could plug into whenever things got hard. And the moment that utility got unplugged, instead of asking why, instead of questioning how things had gotten to this point, they tried to scare me back into place with paperwork. The irony wasn't lost on me. I work in compliance. I read policies for a living. I know exactly what coverage laws do and don't say, and I knew this letter was fluff, emotion wrapped in legal language, designed to rattle me. But it still cut deep. Because if my own parents could reduce me to a source of lost benefits, what did that say about what I'd meant to them all these years? I didn't respond. Not right away. I forwarded the letter to Ben, a coworker of mine who used to practice law before jumping into health IT, and I asked him for his honest take. He called me within minutes. "This isn't even close to a real threat," he said, voice casual, leaning back into the office chair on the other end of the call. "They're trying to guilt you with legalese. There's no court in this country that'll force you to keep them on a voluntary employer health plan. They're desperate. And honestly, it's kind of pathetic." He paused, then added, "But you know that already. You're not asking me if it's legal. You're asking me if it's wrong." And that's where it stung. Because yes, I knew I hadn't broken any law. I knew this wasn't about rights or rules. It was about something harder to define and even harder to defend, the line between justice and cruelty. I wanted to believe I was standing up for myself. That for once I had said enough and meant it. But part of me, a part that had been conditioned for 30 years to be the good daughter, the easy one, the fixer, was beginning to wonder if I had become something else entirely. I sat with that feeling for a few days. I didn't call them. They didn't call me. It was a Cold War, quiet and passive, the kind that sits in your gut like acid. And then, one night, Jessica called. Not a text. Not a voicemail. A real call, unexpected and late, the kind that comes either from a place of courage or collapse. I stared at her name on the screen for almost a full minute before answering, trying to predict the script, to steel myself for whatever performance she was about to deliver. But when I picked up, what I heard wasn't rehearsed. It was soft, hesitant, real. She didn't yell. She didn't guilt. She just asked, "What happened?" And for a moment, I didn't know what to say, because that was the question I had wanted someone to ask for years, and yet now that it was in the air, it felt too big to answer with words. I told her, "You know what happened," but even as I said it, I realized that maybe, she really didn't. Jessica had always lived in a world where things were handed to her as a way to prevent collapse. If she showed even a hint of strain, someone would step in, mom, dad, a teacher, a boyfriend, to pad the floor before she could fall. And so she had never seen the scaffolding behind her life, the silent labor of others that kept everything standing. She had never seen me as part of that scaffolding. I had just been there, steady, background, safe. She started to cry. She said she hadn't asked them to come with her to the spa, that it wasn't her decision, that she didn't even know the trip would interfere with my graduation until they were already en route. And part of me believed her. But the rest of me, the part shaped by decades of being second, wasn't ready to let her off the hook. I said, "You didn't have to ask. You never have to ask. That's the difference between you and me. You're handed comfort. I have to perform for scraps." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said something that tilted the world under my feet. "Dad might have cancer. He hasn't told Mom yet. He told me, but I think he's hiding how bad it is." The sentence landed like a drop of ink in a glass of water, slow, dark, spreading. It changed everything and nothing all at once. Suddenly, the panic in his voice made sense. The desperation. The legal letter. It wasn't just about losing coverage, it was about fear. Real fear. The kind that lives in your bones when your body starts to betray you. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to ask why he hadn't told me. Why he had chosen Jessica, again, as the bearer of truth and trust. But I already knew the answer. I wasn't the one they turned to when they were scared. I was the one they turned to when things needed fixing. And maybe that's the cruelest part of being the sturdy one. People lean on you, not because they love you more, but because they assume you can carry it without cracking. The call ended without resolution. Jessica cried. I listened. Neither of us apologized. Neither of us made promises. We just existed, suspended between a shared past and an uncertain future. And later that night, as I sat alone with that new, heavy knowledge, I couldn't help but wonder if I had finally crossed a line I couldn't walk back from, or if I had finally stepped into the kind of truth that can't be unspoken. Either way, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. The next time I talked to my father, it wouldn't be about coverage. It would be about everything we had refused to say for far too long. When I finally called my father, it was late, far past the hour where conversations begin with small talk or polite restraint. I didn't wait for a decent time or plan the words in advance or weigh the consequences of what might come out of my mouth, because some truths don't need ceremony, and this one had been fermenting inside me for so long that I could taste it bitter, thick, and pressing against the back of my throat like something I might choke on if I waited any longer. The phone rang twice, then again, and then a silence, long and static heavy, before he finally answered with nothing more than my name, spoken not as a greeting but as a statement, flat and uninviting, as if acknowledging my existence had become a reluctant obligation. I told him I got the letter. I told him I wasn't intimidated. I told him that if he wanted to treat me like a resource, a line item on a benefit spreadsheet, then I would start treating him like someone I didn't recognize, like someone who had traded in love for leverage. He didn't raise his voice. He never does, not really. My mother was always the one who wielded guilt like a surgical instrument, but my father? His power came from that particular brand of controlled disappointment that doesn't shout, but makes you feel like you've desecrated a family name, like you've betrayed some unspoken contract written in your own blood. He said, it didn't have to go this far, and I could tell he believed it. That in his mind, this whole thing had escalated because I was being dramatic, emotional, punitive. He still thought I was punishing them, not protecting myself. I asked him why, if he knew his health was at risk, he didn't say something. Why he told Jessica, of all people, the one who crumbles under pressure and wilts in the presence of anything unpleasant. He paused, and when he finally spoke, his voice had a crack in it I hadn't heard since I was 13 and broke my wrist falling off the monkey bars. He said, because it scared me. And I couldn't scare her. I sat with that. Let it sink in. Let the years of being the strong one twist around that sentence like a vice. He was afraid, but not of what was happening inside his body, not really. He was afraid of scaring Jessica, of upsetting her fragile emotional equilibrium. And somehow, that made me the one who could carry it. The sturdy one. Again. Always. So I asked him something I never thought I would dare to ask, not because the question was cruel, but because asking it meant I was no longer willing to pretend we were something we weren't. I asked, do you think I'm less worthy of comfort because I don't fall apart in front of you? The line went quiet. I thought maybe he had hung up. But then, after a breath that sounded like it had been pulled from somewhere deep in his chest, he said, we always thought you didn't need it. There was no apology in his voice, only confusion, as if he was genuinely grappling with the possibility that his assumption had been wrong, as if he had never once considered that silence could mean pain and not peace. That conversation didn't end with healing. There was no embrace, no cinematic moment of reconciliation. It ended with mutual exhaustion, with the vague promise to talk again, with the kind of silence that comes not from distance, but from the sudden realization of how far apart you've actually been all along. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about how easy it is to fall into a role someone else wrote for you, and how hard it is to claw your way out once you've memorized every line. The next morning, I did something that surprised even me. I reinstated their coverage. Temporarily. Just for 60 days. A safety net with an expiration date. I emailed HR, filled out the form, and added a note that it was due to a potential diagnosis. Qualifying event. I did it not because I forgave them, but because I didn't want the narrative rewritten. I didn't want to be the villain in a story where the real tragedy was that no one ever learned to love me for who I actually was, not what I could do. And because deep down I knew that if something truly terrible did happen, I would carry the weight either way. I just wanted to choose how. When the confirmation came through, I forwarded it to my father with no subject line, no message. Just the policy update. He didn't reply. Not that day. Not the next. But a week later, he left me a voicemail, and I'll remember every word of it for the rest of my life. His voice was quiet, but not cold. Tired. A little broken. He said, "We always assumed you were strong enough to be ignored. I guess we forgot that strength still hurts. I don't know how we got here, but I know I wasn't listening. Not the way I should have been." There was a long pause, and then, almost as an afterthought, he said, "I'm sorry." It should have felt like a win. It should have landed with triumph, with vindication. But it didn't. It felt like a wound I'd been holding closed for so long had finally started to bleed, not because it had gotten worse, but because it was finally exposed to air. And that kind of hurt isn't something you celebrate. It's something you sit with. Quietly. Carefully. Like a truth you're not sure you're ready to carry, but can no longer deny. Later that day, I called Jessica. I told her about the coverage. She asked why I'd changed my mind. I told her the truth, because if he was really sick, he deserved care. Not because he earned it, not because I owed it, but because I am not like them. Because I will not turn away from someone in need, even if they turned away from me 1,000 times before. She asked if that meant everything was okay now. I said no. Not even close. But it was something. That night, I sat on my couch, staring at nothing, realizing that revenge is rarely clean, and it almost never gives you what you think it will. Sometimes it just burns everything down, your anger, your pride, your certainty, and leaves you sitting in the ash, wondering if the silence is peace or just the absence of noise. And even though I had offered a lifeline, I couldn't shake the feeling that it might be the last one. Not because I wanted it to be, but because I finally understood that loving someone doesn't mean letting them devour you. And being their daughter doesn't mean being their foundation forever. The clock was ticking. 60 days. And after that, I didn't know what would come next. There's a strange kind of stillness that follows a boundary finally enforced, a silence not born of resolution, but of the unsettling awareness that something has shifted for good, that no matter what words come next or how long the quiet stretches between them, the axis has tilted, and what once passed as normal will never quite be the same again. That was the silence that filled the space between us in those final weeks of coverage, a ticking clock embedded in every phone call, every text, every pause, as though we were all collectively pretending the storm had passed when, in truth, it had simply circled around, waiting for its next point of impact. The reinstatement of their health plan had bought me some peace, but not forgiveness, and certainly not trust. It had been an act of conscience, not of reconciliation, and every time I thought about the decision, I felt the uncomfortable weight of being a better person than I wanted to be. Because the truth was, I had wanted to let them sit with the consequences of their choices, to feel the hollow space that opens up when someone who's always been quietly reliable suddenly refuses to show up. But instead, I had done what I always do. I stepped in, smoothed the edges, filled the gap. And even though this time it came with conditions, with a clearly defined expiration date, the old resentment clung to me like smoke. 2 weeks before the deadline, I got a call from Jessica. Not frantic, not tearful, just unusually calm, her voice lower and steadier than I'd heard it in years. She said Dad had gone in for a second round of tests, that the results were ambiguous, but concerning, that the specialist had ordered more imaging, and that Mom had finally found out, though not from him but from a piece of mail he forgot to hide. Jessica sounded tired in a way that didn't have anything to do with drama, and I recognized something in her tone that surprised me: shame. Not performative guilt, not the kind she wielded like a shield, but real, weighty shame, the kind that sits in the chest and makes you speak slower, softer, less sure of yourself. She asked if I would consider extending the coverage. Not indefinitely, just until there was clarity, some kind of resolution, something more solid than this murky limbo of partial scans and what-ifs. I didn't answer right away. I told her I needed time, which wasn't a lie. I needed time not to decide what to do, but to figure out what I wanted it to mean. Was extending their coverage again another act of compassion, or was it enabling the same pattern I had been trying to break? Was I saving them, or just making it easier for them never to change? That night, I lay awake, eyes fixed on the ceiling, the question echoing louder than sleep. When you protect the people who hurt you, is that love or self-betrayal? Is kindness still noble if it comes at the cost of your own healing? I thought about the girl I used to be, the version of me who waited by the door with a perfect report card, who held back tears when plans were canceled, who listened to whispered apologies that always sounded more like excuses. That girl would have said yes. Without conditions. Without pause. Because love, to her, meant sacrifice, even if the only thing sacrificed was herself. But I wasn't her anymore. So the next day, I did something different. I didn't call Jessica. I called my father. He answered on the third ring, and his voice was slower now, weathered, not just by illness, but by something deeper, like his pride had started to erode at the edges. I told him I had spoken to Jessica, that I understood the situation, that I knew the results weren't in yet. And then I asked him the one question I had never dared to ask before. If I hadn't added you back, if I had stayed silent, what would you have done? There was a long pause. I could hear him breathing, hear the distant hum of traffic behind him, and then, quietly, he said, I don't know. I think I would have pretended it wasn't happening. I think I already was. He didn't ask me for anything. Not forgiveness. Not more time. Not help. And maybe that's what made me soften, what made me feel that familiar flicker of responsibility I had spent so long trying to extinguish. I told him the truth. That I would extend the coverage for 30 more days. That it would be the final extension. That after that, I expected them to figure it out, together, as adults, without assuming I would always be there to patch the cracks. He said thank you. Nothing more. No justification, no praise, no bargaining. Just those two words, bare and unfinished. And then came the part one didn't expect. He said, you were never the villain, Lena. You were just the first one who stopped pretending this family was fine. I didn't know what to say to that. I still don't. The 30 days came and went. I never received another letter. No threats. No emails. The coverage lapsed quietly, without drama. And in the end, it wasn't explosive. It was just over. Sometimes I think about that moment, sitting at my desk with the portal open, my finger hovering over the button that would decide whether or not they would continue to be tethered to me. I think about how small the action was, how little it took to start a chain of events that would change everything. And I think about how, for the first time, I chose myself. Not in anger. Not in revenge. But in truth. Because the truth is, being a daughter had always felt like being drafted into a role I never auditioned for. The fixer. The peacemaker. The reliable one. And walking away from that role wasn't abandonment. It was survival. It was stepping out from under the weight of expectation and finally breathing without guilt choking my lungs. There are still days when I question it. When I wonder if the coldness was too much, if the line I drew should have been softer, if compassion requires self-erosion. But then I remember how many years I spent giving without being seen, carrying without being thanked, existing as a background character in someone else's spotlight. And I remind myself, boundaries are not cruelty. They are clarity. I don't know if my father is sick. Not really. I don't know if Jessica has changed, if my mother ever saw past her own version of the story. But I do know this sometimes, love means saying no. Not because you don't care, but because you finally do. And maybe that's the most painful truth of all. Not everyone who raised you knows how to love you well. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away before they destroy the part of you that's still capable of healing. So who's the villain now? Maybe there never was one. Maybe the only real crime was silence. And I'm done being quiet.